I think the traditional environmental movement has mostly lost its way right now. I don't think it's being very effective, and I don't think it has been for a long time. I'm relatively young still, but almost 20 years ago when I first got involved in the environmental movement, my energy was being channeled towards solar panels, ride your bike, change your personal diet. It was a lot of solutions that the more that I've looked into them, the less robust they've seemed. And I think so many people in the environmental movement these days, their focus is on how can we change things without really changing things? I mean, if you're not willing to fundamentally question the foundations of Western society, the foundations of industrial civilization itself, then the solutions that you will come to solve these problems of global warming, biodiversity collapse, ecological collapse, the death of the oceans, the solutions that you come to will be ultimately ridiculous, because if you cannot question those foundations, that's where the problem emerges from, ultimately. So this is what leads people towards a lot of things that are really just tinkering around the edges of the problem. And when I was young, I got sucked into those solutions myself. I thought that solar panels were going to save the world. Now I realize that you can't just repower this industrial civilization with a different energy source and imagine that it's not going to be destructive, that it's not going to be earth-destroying, that it's not going to be based on infinite growth and an ideology of extraction, right? I used to think that riding my bike everywhere was the way to solve the problem, that everyone needed to ride a bike and that would solve everything. Now I realize that these problems are structural, they're not individual. We can't just individually change the way that we consume, the way that we live, and expect that to save the world, because for many people, living in car culture is not a choice. It's something that we were born into, right? So because of the very geography of our cities, the way that our society is structured, many people have to have a car. They can't survive without a car. They need to get to work. They need to feed their family. They need to do these things, right? These are structural problems and they need structural solutions. And then, you know, changing diets. So many people want to focus on things like changing diets. And I think it's really useful. And I still, you know, I was vegetarian myself for almost a decade. And the values that I got from that experience are still things that I hold very deeply. But my understanding has shifted. I don't think that within the context of an earth-destroying industrial civilization, we can simply change our diets and expect that to change the world. We need more fundamental change in this. We need to change the economic system, the political system, the way that we live at a deep level, not just, you know, these superficial changes to our behavior. So I think the environmental movement has really lost its way. And one of my friends puts it like this. He says, it used to be the case that the environmental movement was about protecting wild places and wild beings. Now, in many ways, the environmental movement has simply become another lobbying arm for certain sectors of the industrial economy. You see so many activists who spend all their time lobbying for solar panels, lobbying for the wind industry, lobbying for electric cars, lobbying for energy efficiency. These are multi-billion-dollar economic segments that are growing rapidly because so many activists have chosen to focus their energy almost exclusively on promoting these industrial technologies, and not just promoting them, but pushing subsidies towards them, pushing tax breaks, pushing all kinds of credits and rebates and so on. Those things have real consequences in the material world, but those consequences aren't that they lower carbon emissions or that they save the planet. Because as we've seen an explosion in solar energy, in wind energy, a growth in electric cars, these things have grown exponentially over the past decade. And at the same time, carbon emissions have continued to rise. Not only have they continued to rise, they're accelerating faster and faster, right? So we are not seeing any of the promised benefits of these technologies actually appear. And that's because they are born of the same industrial paradigm that created the fossil fuel economy. You really can't separate wind turbines or electric cars from coal-fired power plants, from oil extraction, from fracking, from mining and mountaintop removal. These industrial technologies are essential to the so-called green technologies that so many environmentalists dedicate themselves to. They dedicate themselves to it. And you know, a decade ago, 2 decades ago, if you had told me that environmentalists would be arguing in favor of increased mining, increased drilling, increased extraction, I would have told you were crazy. But that's the reality now, is we have people who are claiming they're environmentalists, claiming that they want to defend the planet, and yet their actions are to promote industrial extraction and industry, to promote the construction of more factories, to promote the production of more goods, which, as we know, are just extracted from the planet in a very destructive way.
What do you think the modern environmental
Tall grass.
What do you think the modern environmental movement at this point, you know, it used to be about wild places. What do you think it's actually fighting for at this point?
I think the modern environmental movement has largely been co-opted. And I don't necessarily think that there's some shadowy cabal of people who are, you know, malignantly trying to steer this environmental movement in certain directions. I think it's more basic than that. It's more fundamental than that. When you live in a capitalist society like we do, money talks, right? And most nonprofit organizations, most organizations that are working to protect the natural world, they need funding. And so where do they go for that funding? They go to foundations, right? These foundations are funded by rich people because those are the people that have the money to give away, right? I can run a fundraiser for my organization and we might get 100 donations. We might get 200 donations, and at the end of the day, we come up with $5,000, we come up with $10,000. These foundations can write a single check for $50,000, and that's chump change, right? They can write a check for $500,000. They can write a check for $5 million. They can throw a lot of weight around with that money. And so what you see is these foundations, they deliberately put their money towards projects which don't threaten their bottom line, don't threaten the status quo. And again, I don't think that they're being malignant about this. I don't think they're deliberately trying to mislead the environmental movement. I think that they hold certain values. They hold capitalist values. They hold extractive values. They value the status quo. And so for them, it makes sense. You put themselves in their shoes, and it's understandable why they would fund projects that make sense within their worldview, right? And those projects that make sense within their worldview don't threaten the status quo. In fact, they reinforce it. They don't threaten the industrial system. In fact, they reinforce it. They don't threaten capitalism. In fact, they reinforce it, right? So when you have this system where there are thousands of nonprofits all around the world, there are thousands of foundations funding these groups, then what you see is a social movement that has gradually been co-opted by the wealthy for their own benefit. And it has taken a movement that at its roots, if you go back to the roots of the environmental movement, the foundations of it are revolutionary because they ask those fundamental questions. What are we doing to this culture? What are we doing to the planet? What are we doing to other living beings? Do we have a right to do that? And how can we live in different ways? These are the fundamental questions that have a real revolutionary potential in them because they cause us to question everything about this way of life. That's the root of the environmental movement. And that is rightly seen as a threat by the wealthy, by the ruling class, by governments, by corporations. And so it is much easier for them to put money, to put energy towards a very watered down version of this movement than it is to accept a real oppositional resistance movement or a revolutionary movement that's fighting back against them actively, right? So that's what we have seen over the past decade, the past 2 decades, 3 decades. We have seen the environmental movement, which originally had this revolutionary foundation, come to almost completely act in support of the ruling class, act in support of the status quo. And this has happened so gradually that I think many people have been fooled by it. And again, I don't think it's some great conspiracy. I don't think that there's people hiding in the shadows who are trying to chart the course of history in a certain way. This is all very open, you know? All you have to do is look at what's happening, look at the organizations, look at the funding, look at where it comes from, look at their values, and you can understand what is happening. And I think it's good to push back against the conspiracy theory narrative, because it's not a conspiracy theory, it's out in the open. Right? Capitalism is not a conspiracy, it's just the ruling ideology of the planet, right? Industrial civilization is not a conspiracy. It's obvious to anyone who's paying attention what's happening. And we need to do the same critical thinking when we look at the environmental movement. We need to understand how it's been gradually co-opted from being about the natural world to being about protecting industry. Great. I don't think most people really know what the Green New Deal is, because as far as I understand, it's still just a policy proposal. It's not actually a formalized document. There's not an actual plan. And I think to give credit where credit is due, or where credit should be allocated, the Green Party originally came up with the idea for a Green New Deal decades ago, right? And that's recently been taken up and pushed forward by a bunch of people, a bunch of organizations. And from my looking at it, there are some good things that are being proposed as part of the Green New Deal, and there are a lot of things that aren't really helpful. I think the Green New Deal is a great example, like with so much of the environmental movement, of a situation where people are really focused on the well-being of human beings and not so much on the well-being of the planet, right, and of non-humans. So we see such a big emphasis on green energy, we see such a big emphasis on jobs, we see such a big emphasis on technology and improving efficiency. And some of these things could be useful, like living in an efficient way, absent, any other considerations, is useful. I mean, that's a good thing. But what most people don't understand is that efficiency within capitalism often ends up serving the industrial system itself. It ends up serving capitalism. Businesses love efficiency, because more efficiency means that they can make more profit, right? Their costs go down. If they're more efficient with the goods that they use, if they're more efficient with energy, they don't have to spend as much on materials or on those energy costs, and their profits rise. And those profits, they don't just disappear, those profits are reinvested, right? So that's where you get greater economic growth. So a story of increasing efficiency leading to increasing growth is basically the story of industrial capitalism. And with the Green New Deal, I think a lot of people...
Sorry, I just cut out for a minute.
Are you...
Test.
With the Green New Deal.
With the Green New Deal. Test. Test.
Yeah, I don't know what that was. Let's keep going, but I'll...
Okay, yeah. You can just start off from with the Green New Deal.
So with the Green New Deal, I think we are seeing a lot of people focused primarily on human well-being. And, we see politicians like AOC focusing so much on the Green New Deal and collaborating with organizations like The Intercept and different filmmakers and different nonprofits to really push this vision of a Green New Deal. And I think that what they're ultimately promoting is a vision of a greener industrialism, a more sustainable industrialism, right? The Green New Deal, and by extension most of the climate movement, isn't really focused on preventing the loss of biodiversity, isn't really focused on stopping the toxification of our planet, isn't really focused on stopping the murder of the oceans or ocean acidification. It isn't really focused on stopping soil erosion or the destruction of meadows and prairies like this area. It isn't really focused on stopping logging, right? It's focused on global warming. And what people need to understand is global warming is a symptom. Global warming is a symptom. It's not the main root of the problem. And when you only treat symptoms without treating the underlying disease, then you're just going to displace the problem into some other arena of life. When the car was first introduced, people hailed the car as the solution to a major pollution problem that was happening at that time. And the pollution was the shit that the horses made, because horses were the main means of transportation and of hauling freight and goods in cities all over the world, right? So these horses were causing major pollution problems. And so when the car was introduced, people thought, wonderful. Now we can get rid of these horses. We don't have to feed them anymore. We don't have to devote all this land to growing hay and grain for these horses. We can get these horses out of here. We can clean up the streets, and we'll have these cars instead. And now look where we are, right? That's what we're seeing with things like the Green New Deal. We're seeing an attempt to displace the problems into another arena of life. That's not a fundamental solution. And that's what we see with so much of the environmental movement. You know, AOC just the other day was talking about nuclear power and how nuclear will likely have to play a major role in any Green New Deal type legislation going forward. And the environmental movement has always resisted nuclear power, has always fought nuclear power, because we understand that it's an atrocity, right? To dig up these ores that need to remain safely locked underground, to intentionally concentrate some of the most radioactive, dangerous material on the planet, and then intentionally release it and store it in locations where we know it won't be safe for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, even billions of years, right? To intentionally desecrate and poison the planet. For what? For energy, right? For energy, for power. And that's why I say sometimes that power corrupts. Literally, electricity, that type of power, it corrupts. It corrupts people, because when you get so used to this modern, high-energy, industrial way of life, you are willing to make sacrifices for that. And it becomes about your comfort and your convenience and the things that you need, right? It's not about the planet anymore. It's not about other beings. It's not about living in a good way or in good relationship with the planet, with other humans, with non-humans. It's about you. It's about your selfish needs. And so I think this turn towards nuclear that we're seeing is really frightening. You know, you have people like George Monbiot, you have people like James Hansen, the climate scientist, vehement supporters of nuclear power now. And these are supposed environmentalists.
And what's the problem with seeing renewables like solar and wind and dams as, I guess, essentially as the solution to the climate crisis? Or, you know, all of it.
Well, you bring up dams. So a lot of the proponents of the Green New Deal and a lot of proponents of green energy in general love to point to a scientist and engineer named Mark Z. Jacobson from Stanford University. And Jacobson has done all this research and put together these models showing how the world could transition to 100% green energy for all of its needs, right? And to do this, in the United States, for example, in his calculations, he included hydropower, not just the hydropower that we have now. He counted on, in his plan, expanding hydropower capacity by a dozen times, literally multiplying by a factor of 12 the amount of hydropower capacity we have in this country, which would be the equivalent of building something like a new Hoover Dam every day for years, right, to supply this new hydropower capacity. This is what he relied upon in his plan for quote-unquote green energy. We already know the damage that dams have done around this country, around the world, to fish, to rivers, to forests, to all the beings whose lives depend on free-flowing rivers. I mean, we're not far here from the Willamette, and the Willamette has endangered populations of salmon, the Chinook, who are on the brink of extinction because of the dams, in addition to overfishing and pollution and logging and other issues. But the dams are what prevent the migration of the fish, right? And that has so many effects throughout the entire community, the natural community. I mean, those salmon come up and they fertilize the forests with their dying bodies, right? They feed the bears, they feed the eagles, they feed the fish, they feed everybody. Depends upon these salmon, who essentially ferry nutrients upstream from the ocean, and in this way act like one of the great pumps of this planet, the great cycles of nutrients and life and energy, just like the geologic cycling of carbon or nitrogen, or like the cycling of the seasons, or like the cycling of the water, the hydrologic cycle, right? These fish have been all but eliminated because of dams. And, you know, I learned a couple years ago that there's a species of freshwater mussel that lives in the Willamette River over here. I've seen them. And they also live in the tributaries and other waterways around here. Freshwater mussel, I think they can live to be over 100 years old. And their reproductive strategy, they sit in the bottom of the river and they stick out a little lure. It looks just like a fishing lure. And the purpose is the same. It's to get a passing fish to bite onto it. And when a fish bites it, it detaches and it stays on the fish. It grabs hold and it literally hitches a ride on the fish upstream. That's how these mussels reproduce. They're completely dependent on free-flowing rivers and the fish who live in them. And because of the dams, these populations are aging. They're no longer able to reproduce. They're no longer able to refresh themselves. So you have these isolated populations of old freshwater mussels living in between the dams in different parts of the basin. And because they can live so long, they're still alive, right? And yet, the longer that situation lasts, the less their chance becomes. More and more of them are dying all the time. So, the idea that we can simply repower this industrial civilization with a different energy source and that the problems will be solved is a fantasy. It's insane. It's literally insane to imagine that. Because what has this culture done with energy? It has used it to destroy. It has used it to exploit. It has used it to grow, right? So when the Industrial Revolution came along and people started burning coal for the first time, they didn't stop burning wood. And when people started burning oil for the first time, they didn't stop burning coal. And when people started burning natural gas for the first time, they didn't stop burning oil. And when nuclear power came along, people didn't stop burning natural gas. Now we have wind and solar, these different energy sources that have come along. People are not stopping the use of those other energy sources. They're simply being added on top. That's the growth imperative right there in one sentence, right? So that's what we live in, is a culture that is based on this really self-destructive, omnicidal desire for growth, desire for profit, desire for expansion. And that ideology is so deeply indoctrinated into so many people in this culture that questioning it is almost impossible for them. And the idea that we can simply give these people a different energy source and that they will make responsible decisions with that energy is insane to me. We need less energy, right? The only green energy is less energy.
So, right, I think there's a deer back there. Right now, we're basically, Extinction Rebellion, everybody we've talked to is essentially doing everything they possibly can to keep the Earth below 1.5 degrees. Even though that's probably, an underestimate.
Right.
But say we manage to implement, renewables at a massive scale, and say, we even do manage to phase out fossil fuels and transition completely to renewables. At what cost would that come to the planet? What would that essentially mean, as essentially giving our civilization a lease on life, What would that mean for the natural world?
There was a study that was released in a journal called PLOS One a year or two ago, and it looked at the main threats to natural land around the world from different types of activity. So it looked at agriculture, it looked at urbanization, suburban sprawl, it looked at mining, and what it found was that two of the biggest threats were solar and wind expansion. If you look at all of these projects that are being proposed around the world, two of the leading threats to wild land are wind and solar energy, right? People need to understand what this means. These technologies are fundamentally destructive to the planet. And I don't just mean that they're sort of harmful kind of way. They're extremely harmful to the land. There's a place that I have spent a lot of time in eastern Nevada. It's a place called Spring Valley, and I spent a lot of time there as part of a campaign against water extraction. The city of Las Vegas was trying to build a giant pipeline and extract all the water from this region and pump it 200 miles south to feed Las Vegas, one of the most unsustainable cities in the world, as they all are, really. And that project was just recently defeated after 31 years of resistance from the people on the ground. 31 years of fighting back as hard as they can. You know, led by the local indigenous communities, led by, you know, the local people who have lived there for a long time. And in this valley, Spring Valley, there is a wind energy generation facility. I won't call it a wind farm because I think farm is this sort of deliberately misleading word. Like a farm is a place where you see birds and bees and wildlife, and there are hedgerows and streams. It's not a wind farm, it is a wind energy generation facility. And when you drive into the site, what you see is, before you get there, you see this beautiful natural sagebrush dominated ecosystem. Sagebrush, bitterbrush, rabbitbrush, all of these Great Basin plants living on this valley floor. And to somebody who only knows the natural world from northwest forests, it may not seem very imposing or dramatic or beautiful. But it's this stark form of beauty. And there's an incredible amount of biodiversity in these areas. And in the bottom of Spring Valley, it's named that because there are natural springs that seep up from the valley floor. There's quite a bit of water there. Now, when you go into the wind energy generation facility, what you see is an area that has been completely bulldozed. All the natural vegetation has been completely removed. And what has grown up in its place is invasive, non-native plants like cheatgrass, which basically provides very little to no food value or habitat for any of the native wildlife. Ironically, there's a sign right next to all this cheatgrass that says, "Restoration in progress, please stay off," right? So this is BLM land, it's a BLM permitted project. So the BLM says that this is restoration in progress, when what they've done is, for the sake of wind energy, for the sake of power, they have come in, they have destroyed what was a pretty pristine natural habitat. You know, it was impacted by cattle grazing, by other things, but in comparison, it was a functioning natural habitat for countless creatures: pronghorn antelope, elk, spiny great horned lizards. And so I walk up to the first wind turbine in this facility, and right at the bottom of the wind turbine is a dead bird. I'm not making this up. There's a dead bird at the bottom of this first wind turbine. It's a hawk, but we can't tell what kind of hawk it is because it's been so mangled by this wind turbine. Wind turbines don't just kill birds, they eviscerate birds. And in massive numbers, massive numbers. You know, we see these numbers of birds that wind turbines kill. We see advocates throw them out there like, oh, it's such a small amount. Well, at the same time, they can turn around and argue that we want to increase the amount of wind power by a factor of 100, right?
What's the logical conclusion?
Well, the thing about this is the birds aren't even the worst thing, because wind turbines have a much worse effect on bats. And what they do to bats is they don't just strike them and kill them, they cause what's called barotrauma, which means as these wind turbines blades spin, they may look like they're moving pretty slowly, kind of ponderously, but the outer edge of that blade can be moving very fast, like 200 miles an hour, right? And as that blade moves past, it creates a pressure wave behind it, an area of extreme negative pressure. And if a bat or a bird flies through this zone, the pressure can literally explode their eardrums. It can explode their lungs. It can explode their heart. This is barotrauma, pressure injury, right? And this is what wind turbines do to birds and bats en masse, right? There are certain bird and bat species which, even based on the wind energy that's installed right now, those species may be driven to extinction simply because of wind energy. So these are the compromises that we make when we say that we need power, we need energy, we want more. More for humans, more for industrial society, more for our machines, more for our factories, more for our stores. And what people need to realize, years ago, I helped organize a conference in California, and one of the speakers there was Chief Kayleen Sisk of the Winnemem-Wintu tribe. She grew up in Northern California. The tribe is still not federally recognized as an official Indian tribe by the government, so they never had any assistance. They don't have an official reservation. She grew up very poor. She grew up without electricity. And up on stage that day, she said, "People forget electricity is a convenience. We don't need this." And people need to recognize that. This is just the straight up truth. It's not complicated to understand. We don't need industrial sized amounts of energy. We don't need industrial amounts of electricity. We just don't. And if you want that, then you set yourself against the living planet.
What do you think, so what do you think, power is taken as really as a given for most people, and it's really taken as something that we have to expand to parts of the world that don't have it. And you're saying that, we shouldn't have it. What do you think, what does that mean for what we should be doing right now?
Well, I think part of what we need to understand is that, in the United States, we're living on stolen land right now. So this is Kalapuya land that we're on right now. And the wealth of this country was built on stolen land and on slave labor. That's where most of the wealth of the United States come from. And no matter where you live around the world today, the industrial wealth that has been created, it comes from slavery, it comes from sweatshop labor, it comes from fossil fuels, it comes from stolen land, and it comes from the destruction of the natural world, the theft from the natural world, right? A lot of people, I can give one example to help explain this. Sometimes when I talk about agriculture being destructive, people don't understand that. But I think it's incredibly important that people do understand, because this is one form of theft that's become fundamental to this culture. And I don't just mean all growing plants. Like, we can grow plants in ways that don't harm the land. It can be done in ways that we work in balance with the natural systems, right? But what agriculture is you take a piece of natural land like this, you cut down every tree, you plow up every plant, you kill every living thing in this area, down to the bacteria, by exposing them to the UV radiation. And then you replant it to human use. So what you've done is you've taken all the primary productivity, all of the sunlight coming into that area of land, and instead of sharing that energy with a biodiversity of life, with thousands of different species, you're appropriating all of that for human beings, right? You control all of the energy coming onto that plot of land, and you keep it all for the benefit of human beings. So this sort of ideology of extraction, of enslaving the land to our values instead of finding ways to live in balance and in relationship with the land, right, with these natural systems, that's the root of the problem that we are facing. I don't think I answered your question, but...
No, that's okay. That's a really good point. So what does that, I guess, imply for the ethicality of essentially having a world where there are 7 billion people?
Well, so here's the thing. Nitrogen is an essential element of life, right? We get nitrogen from our food. But these days, most of the nitrogen that we ingest, it doesn't come from the land, it doesn't come from nitrogen-fixing bacteria, it doesn't come from the soil, it comes from fertilizer. And that fertilizer was made from fossil fuels through something called the Haber-Bosch process. You turn natural gas into fertilizer, you apply that to industrial farmland, And then we literally consume the nitrogen that came from natural gas. So at this point around the world, something like a third to half of the nitrogen that every person has in their bodies comes from fossil fuels. So literally, around the world, a large proportion of our biomass is fossil fuels, comes directly from fossil fuels. The only reason that there are 7.5 billion people and counting on this planet is because of that ongoing theft from the land, is because of that ongoing destructiveness to the land. Now, I'm not saying that we should go out and kill everyone. That's not what I'm advocating for. But I do think that we need to grapple with these ecological limits. And we need to understand that with limits come rules for behavior, come rules for how we need to arrange our communities, come rules for how we need to act, right? When you understand the limits of the place that you live, you have to arrange your life in order to live within those limits. Otherwise, you're just stealing from future generations. You're stealing from your children, your grandchildren. You're stealing from future generations of madrona trees, of oak trees, of ponderosas. And the thing is, people really like to get stuck on population, and population is a major issue. It's an incredibly serious issue. But the thing is, it's not actually that complicated of an issue, right? We understand that if most people have 2 or less children, then with natural deaths, population will go down, right? Population will go down. And how do you reduce the birth rate? It's actually been done successfully in many places all around the world in very humane and relatively straightforward ways. You educate women, you empower women in the society, you give them options and power over their own lives so that they can make decisions. And most women will choose to have 2 or less children, right? So this is why I think that we need to understand that feminism, that the treatment of women in our society is not a disconnected issue. It's not unrelated to what's happening to our planet. These things are intimately related. It's no accident that with the rise of patriarchy thousands of years ago, you also have the rise of population growth for the first time to this sort of increasingly exponential level. And it's no surprise that, you know, some of the most patriarchal countries on earth have the highest birth rates, right? And it's no surprise that even in a country like the United States, where perhaps some gains have been made through the battles of feminism over the years, just like they have in many places around the world, we still see population growth. And it's because we still live in a patriarchy. We still live in a situation where women do not have full control over their own lives, still do not have full reproductive autonomy, still do not have full economic autonomy. And because of that, many women are forced into situations that they don't want to be in. And so we see rising population. So I think that people need to understand that if you're concerned about population, you need to be concerned about women. That's the primary fight there. And I think that trying to separate what's happening to the planet from what's happening to human beings is ultimately silly. We're part of this planet. We live here. We're not some sort of separate entity living in a vacuum.
Many people have framed the choice at this point as between essentially climate change, which would be harder for, I mean, not harder is a bad word to use, apocalyptic, and a world where we implement renewables at a, en masse and save ourselves at the very least. What do you think? How would you frame the choice?
There's an old socialist revolutionary, Rosa Luxemburg, who talked about the choice being between communism and barbarism. And I'm not a communist for many reasons, but one of them being that I think communism embraces what I think is an ultimately racist and untrue ideology of economic progress, of industrial progress, of developing the progressive forces of society, and that being a positive thing, rather than an escalation of the war on the planet. And that's a complicated discussion that deserves a lot of time and a lot of nuance. So I won't dive into that too much. But I think the choice that we are facing right now is between an unmanaged collapse. This culture is undermining the ecological foundations of life on this planet. And those chickens will ultimately come home to roost. They are coming home to roost now in different places all around the world. But if you're poor, if you're living in a small island nation, if you're living in Bangladesh, I mean, hell, if you are a Kalapuya person, then the consequences of ecological collapse are already with you because you're not living on salmon anymore. You're not living on acorns anymore. You're not living on an intact land base anymore, in community anymore. You are living in a post-collapse scenario. And I think that we are experiencing a sequence of collapse, an ongoing collapse, a progressive collapse. And that is only going to get worse in the future unless we acknowledge that reality and seriously change our course as a society, as a world. I think that the choice is between revolution and annihilation at this point. If we don't change what this culture is doing to the living world, then it will destroy the majority of life on this planet. And that likely includes human beings ultimately. There's an indigenous writer named Jack D. Forbes. He taught at the University of California, Davis for many years and was part of the indigenous movement in the 70s, and he wrote a book called Columbus and Other Cannibals. And in this book, he talks about Columbus as being a cannibal, not in the literal sense of consuming another being's flesh, but in a metaphorical sense, Columbus and other people like him, the ideology of domination. These people consume the flesh of other beings. They consume the flesh of the planet. They consume forests. They consume oceans, they consume rivers, they consume the soul of human beings, they consume workers, right? They consume those who labor in the factories, those who labor in the fields, they consume slaves, they consume women. And he talks about this idea of the wetico. And what he means by this is he's referring to an old legend that goes back in several indigenous communities of the wetico disease, the wetico sickness. And the idea is that there are these hungry ghosts who wander around the world, and they have an infection, and it's a cannibal infection. It's the wetico sickness. And this infection causes a person to endlessly consume, to just want to consume, to consume, to consume, to not know when to stop, right? It's an ideology of greed, an ideology of growth, endless growth. And Jack Forbes says that this is the fundamental problem that we are facing, is this spiritual sickness that he describes as really having a physical vector. So you may have heard of like meme theory, the idea that ideas themselves can spread like viruses throughout a society, throughout the world, right? And what Jack D. Forbes is essentially saying is that there is a sickness in our world that manifests itself in this destructive behavior, in this arrogance, in this entitlement. And it is passed to other human beings through the vector of culture, through the vector of language, through the vector of mass media and communication, right? And that this sickness causes human beings to do terrible things to one another and to the land. And where this sickness came from, ultimately, I don't know. I mean, that's a question for historians and philosophers, I think, because we can only really wonder and ponder about the mindset of people in the past, right? But I think there are a lot of people who have looked in depth at this, who have really tried to understand what are the roots of this exploitative mindset, this exploitative impulse that some human beings seem to follow to the death of the world, will follow to the end of the world. And one of them, for example, Gerda Lerner, she talks about the creation of patriarchy, her book. You have other people like Jack D. Forbes, Columbus and Other Cannibals. You have countless thinkers who have looked at these issues, and many of them trace them to the same root. They trace them to the origin of agriculture, totalitarian agriculture. And to me, that's not the same thing as horticulture, you know, somebody gardening, permaculture. In this area, in the Willamette Valley, the indigenous people, they set fires. Those fires kept the meadows open. They encouraged the growth of bulbs like camas. They encouraged the oak forests, which produced abundant acorns. The acorns brought in the wildlife, the deer, the elk, the bears. So they had a major impact on the land, and you could really look at this as a form of horticulture. They call these areas camas gardens. There's one only a couple miles from here that's still in pretty good shape. This is different from agriculture. Agriculture is when you cut down everything on a piece of land and you replant it to human use. So in agriculture, we see this totalitarian impulse. You see this domination impulse. You see this mindset of, we are going to take the land and we are going to leash it to our service. We are going to make it serve us. And to anyone who pays attention to ecology, you don't need to know science, but to anyone who watches the land, to anyone who's grown up in forests, who has watched birds, who has watched trees, who has watched plants grow and the changing of the seasons and the insects, if you go to an agricultural area and you really think about what should be there, who are the natural beings who would live there if this farm, this agricultural field wasn't there, you'll understand that what you're seeing is devastation. What you're seeing is an ecological apocalypse. And there are even climate scientists. There was a guy named William Rudiman who writes that the beginning of climate change was not the Industrial Revolution and the beginning of burning coal. He writes that the beginning of climate change was the origins of agriculture. Because thousands of years ago, when agriculture started to expand out of those first centers of civilization, that's when people began to clear the forests en masse. And the forests of Europe, the forests of now North Africa, the forests of most of China, those forests were completely cut long before the first fossil fuels were ever burned. And Rudiman says that the amount of greenhouse gases that were released by the first several thousand years of agriculture are equivalent to what has been released during the entire Industrial Revolution period. So what he says is people who place global warming as an industrial issue fundamentally misunderstand the problem. Global warming is a symptom of civilization. It is a symptom of totalitarian agriculture. It's a symptom of people's profound disconnect from the land and wish to enslave the land to their benefit. And part of the problem with this whole situation is that a couple things happen when you adopt totalitarian agriculture. First, your population can grow much higher because you have a lot of food available and you have a surplus that can be stored easily. Second is that, as Gerda Lerner wrote, patriarchy tends to arise rapidly in these societies. And so women's power starts to be eroded, and that causes the birth rates to rise even higher. The third is that you undermine the ecological foundations of the place where you live, because totalitarian agriculture destroys soil fertility. And that's the basis of all life on land, on this planet. And when that happens, you as a society either have two choices. You can either accept a collapse and change your ways, or you can expand, because you've destroyed the land where you live, you've salinated the soil, you've eroded everything else, or you can go somewhere else and you can take their land. And you can destroy that land and turn it to agriculture and grow your empire even bigger. That's basically the history of civilization in a few sentences right there. It's the history of these agricultural societies expanding militarily across the planet through a process of conquest and converting peoples who were pastoral, who were horticulturalists, who were hunter-gatherers, converting them forcefully to civilization, to totalitarian agriculture. Now, I wasn't there. I wasn't alive at that time. None of us were. All we have is the archaeology, we have the legends and the old stories, we have the mythologies, we have the physical evidence in the land, in the ice cores. So we can try and reconstruct this complicated picture of what happened in the past. But ultimately, we don't really know, right? We don't really know exactly what happened. What we do know is what's happening now. We know what's happening right now. We are here, right? We are alive. We can observe what's happening now. And what's happening now is not so hard to figure out. We have global warming decimating the planet. We have industrial civilization eating its way through the last forests, the last oceans, the last wild fish. We have the oceans acidifying. We have the last grasslands being plowed under and covered with toxic fertilizers and pesticides. We have the collapse of biodiversity, the collapse of insect populations, the collapse of songbird populations. We have the collapse of plankton populations, the foundation of life in the oceans, and the source of most of the oxygen that we breathe. And their populations are collapsing because of industrial civilization, because of the activities of this culture. So the choices that are available to us now are very clear. And it doesn't depend on us understanding the past completely. We don't have to know exactly what happened. And yes, it's good to explore. Yes, it's good to try and understand those historical lessons because we can learn a lot from what happened in the past. But it's even more important that we apply those lessons right now.
What do you think the future should look like?
I don't think it's quite so much about what the future should look like as what the future can look like. And what I mean by that is that the only sustainable way to live is in relationship with the land where you live, right? And what that means is that if human beings want to live in a place long term, then we need to pay attention to that place. We need to know that place. We need to understand that place, not just in an abstract sense. I'm talking literally, go out and sit on the land, spend time in the forest, in the grasslands, next to the river, in the ocean. Try to understand and learn the natural cycles of that place. Observe over long periods of time. And then live in a way that is within the limits of that place, within the boundaries of that place, that shares with other beings. Sustainability is ultimately not a complicated thing. It's not complicated at all. All it takes is attention and time and intention, right? We have thousands and thousands of examples from all around the world of cultures who figured out how to live sustainably in their particular place and then did so for hundreds or thousands, even tens of thousands of years. So the examples are out there. And I'm not saying that the future will look exactly like the past, right? The future will look different from the past because we live in a different world. There are no salmon here anymore, so we can't rely on them. But what there is oak trees. What there is madronas and ponderosas. What there is these meadows. What there is fertile soil. And we can figure out how to live sustainably in a place like this. If we are willing to accept those fundamental ecological limits, if we are willing to set aside the power, set aside the electricity that people pretend is a need, that people pretend is essential for the future, and if we understand that we need to operate within these ecological limits, then living in a sustainable way is not actually that complicated, right? I mean, I live in a habitat much like this, and we eat acorns. We eat food from the land. This land grows acorns. It grows deer. It grows edible bulbs. It grows a lot of edible greens in the spring. Some of the rivers still do grow trout and other fish. We eat the food of the land, and in return, we tend the land. We care for the land.